So I feel like my details are coming together, but the next major component that I want to take into account for the design of the lamp is I really want to think about the relationship from the base and the bottom arm to the upper arm of the lamp. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to create a new document. Try that again. A new project inside Cinema 4D, and I'll just mock up basically what I have. And I'm not really even concerned about the size of these things, but I have a base object. And I'll take, just in this case, one really simple cube. I'll take the X and the Z down. I'm not really worried about its size and its scale. But we'll call this the base, and this is my lower arm. Now what I want to do is I want to build a relationship between the lower arm, the base, and eventually the upper arm, so that when I move one object, the rest of it moves or has restricted motion. And what I mean by that is I'm just going to put this lower arm down just a little bit so it's just kind of floating over my base object. Now, I'm going to take my lower arm, I'm going to copy it and paste it, and I'll turn this into upper arm. Now, if I take that upper arm and just kind of stack it on top, and you'll notice that I didn't move this along the X or the Z again. I'm always just stacking things in Y until I get a better sense of their relationship. Now, I want to be able to position the lower arm. And if I grab the lower arm and I go into rotate, and I rotate that lower arm, currently it's rotating around its center point, its axis. And its axis by default is right in the center of the object, and I'll undo that. Now, in a previous presentation, we looked at the fact that you could take the axis, the enable axis, and we could separate the axis from the object. But when it comes to parametric primitives, you cannot do that. Okay, it's the one of the instances where you cannot by default separate the axis from the object, and the reason is that all of these parameters, when I select the lower arm, all of these parameters in here for the parametric primitive is referencing its center point. There are only two ways that we can get this axis to move from this parametric primitive. The first way is to make the object editable. So we've converted it from a parametric primitive to a polygon object. And the moment that it's a polygon object, we can toggle this enable axis tool and we can move that around. Okay, that's one option. Now the downside of this option is that now we've converted our lower arm from a parametric primitive, which was very convenient because if we decided on a size change, we had the parameters to be able to manipulate that. This is now a polygon object, and therefore Cinema 4D doesn't care that it started out as a cube. It's keeping track of its points, edges, and polygons, and its axis can be moved independently of the object. We toggle this button, the axis button, now we can move the object and the axis together. That's one way. I'm going to Command Z to undo until my polygon object turns back into a parametric primitive, and I can tell because that icon changed in the object manager. Now there's another way to get it to move, and it's just a real quick trick that if I select the lower arm and I go to Object Group, and you might be scratching your head saying, that doesn't make sense. You're grouping just one object, and groups are typically reserved for grouping more than one object. Well, in this case, we know what happens when we select two objects when we make a group. We get a null object with the contents of whatever selected inside the null. Well, if I select just one object and I go to Object Group Object, I get a null object, and the contents of that null is whatever I have selected. And so this null object I could call, I'll just borrow the same name. I'll call it lower arm for now. This was a null object, and a null object inherently can have its axis point moved. So I still have my parametric primitive intact. It still has its registration point set to the center, but its parent object, this null empty container, we can move its axis anywhere that we want. And what I want to do is I want to slide this down towards the base. And if I want to be really precise, again, I can look at this from a front view or from the right view. And I'll just change that to quick shading with lines, and I'll figure out where I want this point to rotate around. Once I end up moving that axis, I'll toggle the axis button off. I'll go back to my perspective viewport. I'll select the rotate tool. Now when I rotate, it's rotating around its axis point. Okay, which is exactly what I want to do. And I think that there's a benefit to preserving the parametric primitive in this case. Now, the downside of that is that we got an extra object in the hierarchy, and that can start to get a little bit confusing. But the sooner that we overcome that and can manage our object manager effectively, the better off we're going to be in Cinema 4D. So let me borrow that technique again. I'll go to the upper arm, and rather than making it editable to move its axis, what I'll do is I'll just group it. So I'm going to select the upper arm, Option G to group. I'll call this upper arm. And again, the only reason we group that is that gives us the ability to grab the axis. I'll go to move, and I'll move that down. And I'll just kind of look at the intersection between those two parts. I'll toggle the axis off, and now if I go to the rotate, now the upper arm rotates around its registration point. So I'm thinking about the lower arm is going to rotate, and it's attached to the base, so its rotation seems to make sense. The upper arm is going to be attached to the lower arm, so its rotation more or less makes sense. But now we got a little bit of an issue. I can rotate the upper arm, but when I grab the lower arm and rotate that, obviously we have a glitch. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to have to, kind of cheat and move this stuff around to line it up, because we might want to animate this at some point. And so what we can do is we can build a parent-child relationship between these two objects. In other words, we can essentially build a real specific group, build a very specific relationship. And the idea here, to visualize this, basically what I want is whenever I want the lower arm to move, I want the upper arm to move with it. And when that's the case, what I need to do is make the upper arm a child of the lower arm. And I can do that just by dragging and dropping the upper arm into the lower arm. So our hierarchy gets a little confusing if we're, we have all this stuff now that we're looking at, but the idea here is the lower arm is now the parent object. And the rule with the parent is that wherever the parent goes, the child goes with it. If I go into the lower arm, I can still articulate the lower arm and bend that and move that around. But the minute that I go back to the lower arm, as I move that, the upper arm moves with it. And so we'll eventually do the same thing with the base. The idea is that if I were to move the base around, obviously I want the rest of the lamp to go with this. And that being the case, I'll take the lower arm, or that whole rig that I just put together, and I'll drop that into the base. So I could take the base and move that around. I could rotate it in any direction that I want. And then I can go back to the lower arm and position that. I can go to the upper arm and position that. And of course, we'll do the same thing with all of the other parts of the lamp. So it's very important to stay organized. The other thing that I want to point out is that as I'm modeling this, I'm going to undo until everything stands straight up. Okay, now I could have just gone into these individual objects and zeroed out the rotation, because at this point, once we start moving these, we're dealing with the rotation values. So I can just go through and zero everything out, and the result should be that everything stands back up. But I don't want to start to move or pose this object until I have the whole thing designed, because it's going to be really hard to line something up with the end of the upper arm if I have things in this kind of crazy position. So if I take the upper arm and I move that, and I take the lower arm and I move that into position, it's going to be really hard to attach the end of the light onto this object and have it line up really well, at least unless you're really comfortable with the coordinate system. It's going to be a lot easier to do that if this object is standing straight up and down. Okay, so and just remember, we'll start to manage. I'm rotating this in 3 different axes. Definitely not what I want to do. But if I want to get that back to its original position, all I have to do is zero out the rotation value, hit the apply button, and it's right back where it started. So I'll apply all that information, all those techniques, into the lamp that I've started, but I'll do that in the next presentation.